Okay, excellent. Well, hello everybody from Half Moon Bay, California. And what I'm going to speak to you about this evening is some work that we've been doing around what we call science fiction prototypes. And we've been using it to explore artificial intelligence and robotics and free will. And the science fiction prototype is really a short story based upon science fact, but we'll explore that, and I'll explain more about that as we go through the presentation. Before I begin, I'll give you a little background about myself and my group at the Intel Corporation. I am in the user experience group, and I am what's called a consumer experience architect. And what that means is that I architect the consumer's experience 5 to 10 years out, and what that might be with our products. And so I begin to look at and write up the specifications for what that might be. And to do this, we have a group of anthropologists and ethnographers who actually go out and gain an understanding of what people are doing in their homes. And then we work together with the engineers to build these products. And then we also work with the customers to bring these products to market. And a good bit of the work that I do outside of what I'm going to talk to you tonight is actually around television and the future of television. So what you can see here on the slide is just a screenshot of a book that we're actually going to be releasing in the beginning of 2010 that kind of gives an overview of the work that we've been doing around the future of television. But that's an overview of what we do and what our group does. But what I want to speak to you about this evening is something a little bit different, a little bit further out, where we've been thinking about what the consumer's experience might be, or what the experience might be with technologies that are a little further out. And this is where we'll begin to look at again, robotics and free will and science fiction, and how that might be used as a tool for development. In 2007, I presented a paper at the Intelligent Environments Conference entitled "Do Digital Homes Dream of Electric Families?" And in this presentation, it was an outline of what we call consumer experience architecture, and that is the illustration that you see here on the screen. And it's a way of taking a very traditional product development process, which you can see here in the middle, which takes us from exploration and planning through development and into deployment. And what it allows us to do is take different pieces of information and feed them into that product development process. Where we can take some ethnographic understandings, where we can take some consumer experience specifications, and how we can actually use this to build products. At the end of that presentation, I put out a challenge, if you will, that said one of the things that we could do as we began to understand the cultural inputs and the mental model inputs into the development process was wondering, could we in fact use science fiction as a way to gain an understanding of how people's mental models are formed of technologies. And what this allowed us to do is to say, could we use this framework, this experience framework, and expand the front end of it so that we could use the science fiction process and the writing of science fiction as a way to, and as a development tool. What we ended up doing over the next 2 years is we did just that. And as you see here, we expanded the front end of the development process and began to think how we could look at emerging theory and emerging science. So use science papers, use research results, feed those into the development process, and then begin to think about how those might be used. So we could look at what the new technologies are, and I think we've seen some early examples of that in the previous presentations. Once we've seen what that technology is, we can begin to imagine how that technology could be used. And one way you can think about that could be usage scenarios, or it could be how consumers might do it. But one of the things we began to think about was to say, well, could we use this conceptual prototyping and do that in fiction? That is precisely what we did. So we began to take scientific papers and feed them into fictional stories and use them as a means to develop some of these ideas around artificial intelligence and robotics. We came up with a series of stories called the Dr. Simon Egerton stories. And some earlier examples of that are ones called Nebulous Mechanisms and The Machinery of Love and Grace. What I want to talk to you about this evening, and I want to read you a little bit from, is from a prototype in a short story called Brain Machines. And Brain Machines pulls from three very specific works that are going on right now. The first is about free will and irrationality in artificial intelligent agents. The second is a work by Michael Brooks, which began to look at free will and used emerging work being done in neurology and understanding how the brain works and gaining an understanding of free will and basically coming to the understanding that human beings have a very tentative grasp on free will, that there's some emerging work going on of showing that our notion of free will is quite thin. And then the final paper was also about free will in AI and intelligent agents and how we actually might be able to prevent AIs from actually gaining free will. So we took all of these as inputs into the process, and what we came up with was this story called Brain Machines, in a way of exploring the implications of this science, what it meant, and then also putting it into sort of real-life scenarios. And so what I'd like to do is read to you, just from the very opening of this story, and then tell you what's happened after, since the prototype has been written, to give you an understanding of now how we're going about in using these. As you'll see as I go through, there's, as a part of this, we've had an illustrator coming along as well to actually come up with some illustrations for the stories, to give them better visuals. So I'll just, like as I said, read the beginning of this to give you an understanding. Brain Machines. Jimmy, fix me another drink, Dr. Simon Egerton said as he sat in his cramped apartment buried in a clog of stations that ringed the planet Earth. No problem, Jimmy replied cheerfully and set off to the makeshift bar. Jimmy was a pet project of Egerton's. He was an off-the-shelf clean room assembly bot that Egerton had modified into a somewhat old-fashioned service robot. Egerton had been experimenting with Jimmy during his free evenings. At a little over 3 feet, Jimmy was a cute little guy. His rounded hips and oversized half-skull made him teeter when he moved across the floor. He looked like a child just learning to walk. How are you feeling? Egerton asked Jimmy. Fine, thanks, Jimmy replied, mixing the gin and tonic. We're running low on Tanqueray. He turned and waddled a few steps with the drink, concentrated and careful not to spill. Thanks. Egerton took the drink and searched the bot for any sign of anything out of the ordinary. No problem at all. Jimmy waddled back to the makeshift bar and tidied up. Egerton sat his fresh drink on the floor next to the chair, Egerton set the fresh drink on the floor next to the chair, lined up with 5 other untouched cocktails. After a moment, he asked, Jimmy, will you fix me a drink? No problem, Jimmy replied cheerfully and started on the 7th cocktail. Egerton puzzled at the back of the little bot. He knew that Jimmy knew he wasn't drinking the gins. Egerton knew that Jimmy knew he was being tested and that it was silly to keep on making gin after gin, but Jimmy wouldn't react. He wouldn't break out of his service duties and ask what was going on. Why wasn't Egerton drinking the cocktails? Was there something wrong with them? It was a problem of will, free will. Jimmy had the capabilities to question what was going on, but he wouldn't do it. It was a problem Egerton had been trying to crack for over 6 months. We're running low on Tanqueray, Jimmy said, finishing the drink. Then the phone rang. Simon Egerton, Egerton said into the phone, wary of any call that came in that had such little information attached to it. The caller's ID was from Ashley Wenzel. Simon, can you hear me? I cannot tell if this thing is working. Egerton recognized the caller immediately. The pinched and impatient face of Dr. Sellings Freeman came over the cheap phone connection. Sellings had been Egerton's professor and sometimes mentor at the university. He was neither a good professor nor a good mentor, but Egerton had learned a lot from the pompous old man. Plus, Sellings had gotten him his first research grant, so Egerton felt forever in his debt. Hello, Sellings, Egerton replied. Why does your name come up as Ashley Wenzel? I had to borrow this girl's cell phone. I cannot explain. I do not have time. I think I am breaking some law just by making this call. Sellings was distracted and tense. I need your help, Simon. I need your help, and there is no one else I can ask. What's wrong? Egerton grew concerned. He had never seen Sellings so upset. The pompous old man was unflappable. What's happening? He asked. I can't say right now. What? Yes, wait a minute, 1 minute. Sellings' attention shifted. I'm almost done. I need my phone back. A girl's voice came across the line. You said I am almost finished. Sellings answered, annoyed and frustrated. Simon, I need you to come to Marlinga Gardens right away. There's no one else I can ask for help. You mean you're on Earth? Simon was shocked. Why are you down there? Why would you possibly 1357 Anagu Way, Sellings barked. That's where I'm staying. 1370 Anagu Way, Marlinga Gardens. Can you come right now? I can try. Egerton wasn't sure what to say. There are some things I need to do. I told you I was almost finished, Sellings said, and then the connection went dead. Egerton watched the dead phone for a moment, wondering what to do, and then remembered Jimmy. Oh, I'm sorry, Jimmy, he said, seeing the little bot standing in the middle of the floor, trying to keep the perspiration on the glass from running onto the floor. We're almost out of Tanqueray, Jimmy said, happily handing over the cocktail. I'll get more. Egerton set the glass next to the chair with the others and stood up. Grabbing the Tanqueray bottle, he slipped into the kitchen nook and refilled the water. Stepping back into the living room, he handed the bottle to Jimmy, who checked it, wiped it with a cloth, and returned it to the bar. Jimmy, will you fix me another drink? No problem. Egerton stared at Jimmy's half skull and wondered what to do next. So that is the end of section 1. What goes on inside the short story, which is another good 20 or 30 pages, is an exploration of free will and what's going on Earth, and Earth is a very bad place at this time, is that Sellings Freeman has done a good amount of research around free will and human free will, and has begun to see that humans really scientifically do not have free will. And not only that, but once you begin to question their free will, their sanity begins to crack apart. And it's actually some of the studies that have been done recently and were highlighted in the Brooks chapter about it can bring about some neuroses the more we try to control our free will, and some very bad things happen, and there's a murder case, and it begins to explore the legal implications of free will as well. What ends up happening at the end of the story is Egerton begins to understand how he can use this notion of free will to solve his problem with Jimmy. So after the story was complete, I passed it back to the scientists and the folks who had written the papers. And we began to see that we could use the gin and tonic test. So initially, having Jimmy making gin and tonics for the doctor was a device for understanding free will and was a device for the doctor to begin to think about what's going on. What the scientists and the roboticists and the AI folks that I'm working with began to see, though, is that the gin and tonic test could actually become a real-world test where we could begin to look at this quantum persona transfer, where you begin to have sensor data coming into a control module. Feeding into the control module, you have different sets of personas. You have a bartender, you have a child, you have a worker, and what is happening is that the environmental and social context in the control model are picking the persona, and then it's going into this decision block to kind of understand what to do. And what's happening in the quantum decision block is instead of having a single decision, you actually have multiple decisions going on at one time. And then what happens at coming out is that if the decision that comes out of the quantum block doesn't work for the persona, it can actually send it back and begin to get the persona to shift. So the experiment that they're beginning to work on, and actually that we're looking at building, is beginning to model this AI, beginning to say, well, if Jimmy is making the cocktails and he's in his persona of the bartender, but he's bringing in the information that he's knowing that they're not being consumed, but in the persona, it is only about making the cocktails. In the quantum decision block, can we get it to the point where it can begin to freely generate separate responses outside of that single persona? And then, so what that would allow us to do is to either create a new persona and generate that on the fly, which would be in this diagram P4, or to begin to switch to a different persona to ask why. So that is a very quick overview. I know I'm running out of time of sort of what is going on in this. What we're beginning to do now is we're beginning to build Jimmy. So what we're going to be doing in a series of workshops is to begin to take the quantum approach, to take the gin and tonic test, and begin to model out the AI, and also begin to work with actual robots in the actual mixing of the drinks to see how we might be able to bring that about and be able to actually build it. And so what we've actually had happen is we had let me jump back, these three inputs, so these three pieces of science fact, if you will, around the notion of free will and the notion of these personas, feeding into a piece of science fiction, feeding into a usage scenario, and feeding into what is essentially a prototype. And now what's happened is, with this framework, we've now been able to take the experiments that we've been doing in the fiction, and now we're actually using them as a way to do experiments back in the real world and back in the lab. And not only using it as a means of inspiration for those fictions, but also using it as a way to work out the edge cases of these ideas, or the extremities of these ideas, and understanding what may happen with them. As I said in the story, we even look at some legal implications, but even here, we've been able to take some of the ideas that were in the initial paper and begin to extrapolate them out into a, if you will, fictional but real-world scenario where they might be used. And so now we're going to go back and actually we're looking at building them. So the next steps and the work that we're doing next is beginning to have some of these workshops where we're going to begin to model the artificial intelligence. And we're also going to be running some workshops around this process of prototyping and science fiction prototyping, and always looking for other papers and always looking for more folks to collaborate with. And here's some examples of where we're going to be doing that in the next year. And with that, I will open it up to questions. I know I'm almost out of time, but if anybody does have any further questions, you can always reach me. This is my email address if anybody is interested in any of the workshops or getting any more information on my lecture. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Brian. So thank you very much for a very inspiring talk on free will free will is, of course, a topic that we're all interested in. Now, I would like to briefly open the lecture hall for questions. Do we have any questions on free will? I mean, maybe I can start very briefly with one question. Why do you call
Yes,
it
we have
one
questions from Ajay.
Oh, we have one? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Bon. In the first, thank you very much for your presentation because I found it very, very, very interesting. Then, my question is, if you want, for example, I want to know if you introduce in the head of this machine the speech recognition for making up a good conversation between, for example, this machine and human. Do you understand me, mister?
I believe so. So the question is do we have a module that has the speech recognition?
For meeting with conversation between this machine and human, for example. Do you introduce in the head of this machine what's called speech recognition?
So yes, that is one part. Yes, so that is one part of the experiment that we're looking to bring about, is to actually have the speech recognition module and see how much natural language processing we can use as well to have the AI begin to understand. I think you would use it if you look at the gin and tonic test schematic for the quantum persona function. I think you're precisely right, that sensor data, it is extremely important that sensor data be able to have natural language processing so that it can not only understand what the participant is asking for, but also able to respond in a very natural way, just like the robot in the story does. We've also had, as a side note, some interest in not only studying the AI and studying the robot, but also studying the individuals. So studying the person who is in this case, the person asking for the cocktail, the person asking for it, and getting so we're studying their speech and studying how they interact with the AI and with the robot as well, which I thought was kind of interesting because we're now being able to study the human part of it as well, which I think could be very helpful.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we take, can you switch off the microphone then? Yes, maybe we take one last question from the lecture hall before we finish. One last question. Do we have someone? Otherwise, I would ask it myself. Why do you call it quantum persona? What's the meaning of quantum in quantum persona?
That's an excellent question. So again, if you go back to the quantum persona transfer function, the quantum persona refers to two sections. The first is this notion of the persona being a collection of behaviors that the AI switches between. So, and again, this is of course based on the human brain, where we all have different personas. We have, daughter, husband, student, teacher, and that thinking that we take these different personas and use them as a collection of behaviors. That's the persona part. So being able to switch between those and create new ones, decay ones that we aren't working with. And then on the quantum side, the quantum idea is that instead of having a single decision-making mechanism, so to be very, very simplified, if an AI or a robot, it comes to a corner and it looks and it seems that and is being told that it needs to go left. So instead of simply in the AI having to go left, what happens in the quantum block is it makes all the decisions at the same time. It goes left, it goes right, it goes up, it goes down, it stays still, and those all happen at the same time. So the idea is that for the AI, it's allowing it to make much more rapid decisions and have a much quicker learning, and sometimes even making bad decisions, because they're all happening at the same time.
Okay, so that kind of massive parallelism that will actually be necessary to function in the real world.
Exactly,
okay.
and that massive parallelism, which I think, going back to some of the previous points, that is in our own neurology and in our own decision-making process, where we are doing that parallel processing at the same time, which will allow the AI to be much more robust in a very complex environment.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you again. I think we will close here now.